Hey, welcome everyone. We've made it to my very favorite topic in the course, and honestly, my favorite topic in all of teaching web development, the DOM. So this is very exciting stuff, in my opinion. I look forward to it every time I teach, and when I teach boot camps in person, it's my favorite week, favorite 2 weeks. It's really fun stuff because we start to connect JavaScript with HTML and CSS. This is where I think JavaScript starts to become a lot more exciting. And certainly more visual. You can start to make things with interfaces, things that you can see, enough of the console.logging. So I always look forward to it. Hopefully you're excited about it, especially if you've never worked with the DOM, you don't know what it is. There's a lot to cover here. It won't fit into one section. We have multiple sections. I have a couple of examples I'd like to show of things that we could build after you learn how to manipulate and work with the DOM. So there's some simple ones, like here's a form where as I start typing, notice the placeholder text here that says last name. If I put something in here like Chaplin, notice how the text went down below as a label, and then if I delete it, it goes back up. Very simple little tiny touch, but that's done with JavaScript. So we have the form that is just HTML and CSS. We don't need JavaScript to make that work. If I comment the JavaScript out, well, I just deleted it. Let's comment it out. We still have the form here, but now we're not getting that interactive element. It still looks the same, but we don't get that behavior. Here's another example. This is a fun is relative. It's a game that is a memory game where you have to match different cards and flip them over. I'm terrible at it, but I really like the interface at the beginning. When you start, you get this nice little flip of the card when you click instructions, and then you can click here to actually begin the game and select a level. So the content itself is HTML and CSS. If I comment all of that out, select it, comment it out, we still have the exact same interface. It just doesn't do anything. I'm clicking. Maybe you can hear that through the mic, but we don't get any behavior. We're just seeing that content. It's basically static little blocks of color with some letters. But we add JavaScript in, and now they do something when I click. And I can play the game, go to casual. Like I said, I'm horrible at this game, but the just very act of clicking on something and having it change in any way, changing the color, having it flip, revealing the symbol, that is all JavaScript. The cards themselves are HTML and CSS. It's very hard for me to even attempt to play this while talking, so I'm already terrible to begin with. But as you can see, we've also got this timer going across the top, highly stressful. I'm just clicking randomly at this point. And one more match before the end. All right. So again, this is all JavaScript functionality. This is JavaScript that is making the game logic, that is checking if we get a match. It's checking, oh, geez. It's checking to see if a card has already been clicked on, or if the timer has finished, if you still can play, or if it's game over. Here's another example. This is another nice form where we have different steps of the form, little animations that are triggered. So we go from step 1 to step 3. Each time I click, I'm just seeing HTML and CSS. If I remove all JavaScript one more time, we still have the exact same content. It just doesn't do anything. I can't go from one step to the next. We add JavaScript in, and it's now an interactive, almost like a different set being shown on a stage. When you go see a musical or a performance, a new set being swapped in. And the colors are changing up here to tell you which step you're on. So nothing crazy, but this is all done with JavaScript, all the interactivity. And then now for something a little crazier, much more complex. This is on YouTube. This is a recorded live stream of a really cool musician, very funny guy, Mark Rebillet. It doesn't matter who it is. Anyway, over here we've got comments, hopefully nothing super inappropriate. And as I play the video, you can see these comments start to come in, and they're synced to when they were actually submitted back when this was live. I can click to hide. I can show it again. This is all happening through JavaScript. These elements are being added to the page in conjunction or in time, in sync with this video. They're being added here. So even something just like hiding and showing is done with JavaScript. Being able to pause a video and have this stop. We don't get those new comments now. That's done with JavaScript. If I fast forward, I get new comments. That's done with JavaScript. So JavaScript, the DOM, very exciting stuff. This is where we start to take HTML and CSS and control it, update it, or even just read it and understand it using JavaScript. So something like this is made by a team, obviously a huge team at YouTube, but things like a form or a memory game, the code is really not that bad. But the thing about the DOM that I'll tell you right now is that you have to use tons and tons of methods and properties that we haven't seen before. So remember when we saw arrays or we saw strings and I talked about here's 20 methods that arrays have. When we work with the DOM, we have at least 20, maybe 50 different methods, 50 different properties, and it takes time to get to know the ones you'll use the most, and it's also imperative that you don't try and understand and learn every single property. That's something I'll bring up as we make some more progress. The DOM is just a huge thing. There's so much that you could stress about trying to learn and memorize. Don't approach it that way. We're going to go step by step, and in the next video, we'll take our first step into this beautiful promised land of the DOM. Before we move on, there are some prerequisites, some things that you need to be comfortable with before you can really master the DOM, before this content will make sense to you. Those topics are basic HTML and CSS. The good news is that HTML and CSS are really pretty easy to learn, the basics of at least. We're not talking about making beautiful websites. We're not talking about crazy, complex layouts that are responsive. You just need to understand how to create simple elements on a page, how to nest things together, how to work with IDs and classes, how to write simple CSS selectors to select based off of elements and classes and IDs, maybe attributes. You need to understand how to change colors with CSS and fonts and how to resize something, the basic properties. So if you don't have that understanding right now, I recommend you take an hour or two to go follow a tutorial online. You can check out my YouTube channel. I have a basic HTML and CSS intro, but there are also tons of great courses, paid and free, and books, and free blog posts. You don't need to go, buy an expensive course or even buy anything. Just take some time and set it aside so that this section and the next few sections actually make sense to you. Because this stuff is really exciting, it's fun, but if you don't have that understanding of HTML and CSS, it's just going to be intimidating and make it a lot more challenging than it needs to be. Because this DOM stuff is actually not hard. Where it gets tricky is when people try and learn it before they understand HTML and CSS. So I'm going to do a little demo / assessment that you can self-assess based off of. I'm going to write some simple HTML and CSS to show you the level of understanding I'm looking for. So I have an HTML file already created. I'm going to add some simple elements in here. We'll add an H1, and this will say my web page. I'm going to add a simple UL, an unordered list, with a couple of LIs. First thing, second thing, and third thing. So I have an LI here, or 3 LIs in an unordered list. I'm going to add an image. I'll set the source to be this nice grizzly bear image from unsplash.com. Nice images that we can use for free. And I will also go ahead and add in maybe a paragraph tag or 2 paragraphs. Just let's do some lorem ipsum. So I can just type lorem in VS Code, and then I'll add another one of those, lorem, just random text. I'll add an ID to my image, and I'll call this image, we'll just call it bear photo. So if you're still with me, if this is all making sense and feels like very basic stuff, that's good news. If any of this is confusing, you're not sure what these elements are, you don't know what an ID is or a source, take some time, go learn that stuff, because you'll need it. You absolutely need it for the next couple sections. I don't want you to feel bad or get lost. All right, so we have our H1. I'll also add a class to my LIs, 2 of them at least. This class will be called special. Okay, so I have 2 paragraphs. I have my H1. I have LIs that have a class of special. I have an LI that doesn't, and I have an ID for my image of bear photo. Now I'm going to make a style sheet. So I'll just make my file here. I'll call it app.css. And I'm going to start by styling my H1. Just something simple, color purple, font size 20, oh no, that's going to be very small. How about 60 pixels? So I haven't connected my style sheet, but let's just make sure my content is showing up. All right, now I'll connect my style sheet using a link tag, and the href is app.css. And my H1 should change. It's purple now and larger. So if this syntax is new to you, you haven't seen it, you don't know what font size does or color, I guess that's pretty self-explanatory, but if you're not sure about this syntax here, then take some time and review that. Let's also go and select the bear image. So here's the first little part of the assessment. How would we style this bear image to give it a width of 250 pixels using the ID? All right, so I'm going to come in here and select it with bear-image, and I need to make sure I add in, or bear photo. Oh, geez, horrible name. Can't even remember it. I need to make sure I add in my hash symbol there to make it clear it's an ID, and I'll give it a width of 250 pixels. Refresh my page. Much more manageable. The next part of the assessment, I'd like for you to make the class of special, these two LIs, I'd like them to be teal and 30 pixels font size, and give them a 1 pixel border, also teal. So we'll select the class, which was called special. I need to use the dot because it's a class, and I'm going to start with color, what did I say, teal, and then font size, I think I said 30 pixels, and border was 1 pixel teal. Let's see what we get. All right, so there is my special class. So I've styled the H1, the image with the ID of bear photo, and the two items, the two LIs that have a class of special. It looks horrendous, it's very gross, but this stuff is very important. Don't worry about the styles. But if you feel like any of this was new or confusing, you need some clarity on it, go look online and get some practice. Now here's one more thing that you could use as a little assessment. Let's add in a form. All right, so I'll add a form element right here. And in this form, I'm going to add an input, type equals text. I'd like to give it a placeholder of, what should we do? Bear name. And then another input below that. And instead of type equals text, what are our options here? We'll do type equals, how about password? And then give it a placeholder of password. And then one more input. We'll do type equals submit. We'll refresh, and we have our form here. What I'd like you to do is select only the input that has type of password and give it a different width. You can change it to smaller, larger, just give it a different width and a height. So you'll have to select based off of the type, not off of input. Don't add an ID, don't add a class. Select it as is. So I'm going to do that over here. If I just did input, like I did for H1, that will target all three. And if I do height, let's do 50 pixels, width 100 pixels. That does work, but I only want to target this one right here. So I can add in an attribute selector, type equals password. And now only this one is affected. The other inputs are unchanged. So that's it for the stuff. I mean, that's not everything you need to know, but that's a general sampling of the kind of HTML and CSS experience you need. You need to be able to do basic styles, understand CSS syntax, key value pairs, semicolons, selecting based off of classes, IDs, elements, attributes. There's a bunch of other selectors, and we may come across some of them in the course, but this is most of what we'll be selecting based off of in our JavaScript. And then as far as elements, things like inputs, definitely, paragraph tags, H1s, all the headings, buttons, list items, all the different text elements, paragraphs, semantic elements like block quotes, sections, articles. You don't have to be an expert in everything. Just, I want you to be comfortable enough where you're not focused on the HTML and CSS so much and trying to understand it that you're missing out on the DOM stuff, which is fun. All right, so now we're going to move on to the DOM. Again, please take this seriously. I mean, you're obviously able to make your own decision and do what you think is best. And if you want to just plow ahead without HTML and CSS experience, it's definitely possible. You'll pick it all up at once. But for the best experience, I recommend that you get some practice first, take some time away for just a bit. You're not going to miss out too much. The course will still be here for you. Get better with HTML and CSS, and then come back. All right, so let's get going. All right, now that we have all that housekeeping out of the way, all the HTML and CSS prerequisites, we can now dive into the DOM. Very fun stuff. We're going to start in this video with kind of a taste of the DOM. I'm going to show you some code, different snippets. We'll play around and tweak a web page. And the goal is not for you to understand every line or remember it, because I'm showing you code that we'll see in this section later on, or 2 sections from now. We're kind of looking ahead. So it's more of a sneak peek. Okay, so the document object model, or the DOM, is our window into HTML and CSS and the web page in general through JavaScript. It is our portal into the world of a web page. So we can write JavaScript that can figure out how many H1s are on a page, or how many inputs are in a form, or we can get the value from a form if a user is typing into the form. We can change the value of a form. We could change images, make them bigger. We can change styles of anything. We could add animations. We can listen for clicks or drags or hovers or any sort of event that a user could trigger, and then have some behavior that happens in response. A user clicks on a game piece and it will change color, or if a user clicks and drags a chess piece, when they drop that chess piece, we should write code that checks, is it a valid move? If it is, then move that chess piece to the square. If there's a piece there already, then replace that piece and remove the captured piece from the board. We add logic in with JavaScript that controls, that interacts with, that reads and understands the contents of a page. And the key thing to understand about all of this is the object part. Document object model. When your web page loads up, whatever the web page is, this simple one that we were doing here in the last video, when it loads up, the browser is going to turn it into a bunch of objects, just JavaScript objects. And these objects are all constructed and put together to form the DOM. It is a virtual representation, or a JavaScript representation of the content on a page. And it consists of a bunch of JavaScript objects. So I probably spent way too long making this image, but we have HTML and CSS and some other stuff that goes in, and the browser interprets it, it reads it, and it creates the DOM for you. It spits out JavaScript objects representing the HTML and representing the CSS. So here's a simple example of what I'm talking about. If this was our HTML, a very simple web page, we have an H1, we have a UL, we have 2 LIs. The browser will read this in, which on its own doesn't mean anything. It's just text. It's text content. The whole job of the browser is to display it in a way that makes sense to humans, to make this larger, to make this a bullet point if it's inside of a UL. So the browser reads it, it does all of that, and at the same time, it creates a virtual representation, a JavaScript object of the H1. There's another object for the UL, another object for the LI, and another for the LI. So that's what this is representing over here. Each one of these little circles or nodes is an object. They're telling you that. I'm an object, me too, in case you had any doubts. So they're objects, and those objects have a bunch of different properties. The simplest one that we could see from here would be what their content is, what text is inside the object. Water plants. Okay, so we have one that has a property called text or something like that. It's actually called inner text, set to water plants. We also have tons of other properties for different attributes, CSS styles. We have methods that we can use so that I could delete one of these with JavaScript and it would be deleted from my web page. I could update one of them and change the text. I could even change the type of element. I could, instead of having an H1, I could replace it with an H2. All of that is done through JavaScript where we interact with these objects. All right, so now for the part that is the taste of the DOM, a little preview of where we're going. So I'm on google.com, just a regular homepage. I'm going to just type some code in the console. The first thing we'll see is proof that we get a bunch of objects. The DOM just consists of objects. So why don't we pick something, maybe this button right here. It is an input. Does it have an ID? It doesn't have an ID. Okay, this one has an ID. Is this the I'm feeling lucky button? I'm going to copy this ID and use that to select that element. So this is new. You haven't seen it before, or at least not in this course. Don't worry about it. I hate saying that, but don't stress about what it is. Okay, so if I save this to a variable, const button object, if I look at that button object, I've selected based off of some ID, and I have a representation of it. Unfortunately, in the console, it looks like it's not an object. It looks like it's just HTML. But if I do console.dir, which we've seen a couple times, button object, and open this up, you can see it's just a regular JavaScript object. It's massive. It has tons of properties, tons and tons of methods and properties here, and they all relate to this one button. Let's take a look at one of them. How about the value of the button? If I scroll down, go down to value, it's set to I'm feeling lucky. We also have things like classes and IDs. If I go up to where are you? HIJK, there we go. Here's the ID. We have attributes like hidden. So this is not a hidden element, so it's set to false. We have tons of other things that we're not going to get into right now, but you can see that it's an object, and everything we see on this page is represented with its own JavaScript object. But let's start with this one. So we have our button obj, and I can read the value of that button, which is I'm feeling lucky. I could also change it. I could set it to something else. I am not lucky. Does anybody use the I'm feeling lucky? I haven't. Not on purpose, at least. And we can see we just changed it. It now says I am not lucky. So that's our first interaction with the DOM. The page loaded. All this HTML was turned into stuff we see visually, and at the same time, it was turned into JavaScript objects. We can select and interact with those objects. We can change them in JavaScript. It's just like if I had an object here where I had a value set to 4, just call this O, and then I said O.value is now equal to 56. The main difference, of course, is that when I change O.value, nothing happens. O is different, but there's no side effect. The browser doesn't care. It's not changed. But when I change one of these objects from the DOM, there is an impact. It's reflected in what we see. So changing this JavaScript object is linked to seeing that change in the page. So when we change a style, when we change the text, when we add new elements, we do it through JavaScript objects. And then the browser knows about it. The browser knows, hey, this thing just changed. I better update it for the user or in the browser so that we can see that change. And we'll try one more mildly fun thing, not exceedingly fun. We're going to add an event. So when I hover over this button, I want to console.log something or change the text, although it's already being changed here. We get this nice animation that's from Google. We're not going to deal with that. So why don't we just start by alerting something? So we have our button object, btn obj, and again, this is something we haven't seen before, but we will see it. So we're not going to go into detail here, but this says add an event listener, add event listener to the button. The event we're listening for is a mouse over, and then here's the function I want to run when I do mouse over. And I'll just do an alert, hi. Okay, let's see what happens. There we go, I get hi every time I hover over that button. Anywhere else, it doesn't change, nothing happens, but I go over that button, we get a nice alert. So we could replace that code with anything else. Usually we don't alert. We might change the content of the button. We might instead, we could do anything. We could change the color. We could add new elements to the page. We could delete every single thing from the page. We could animate things. We could send a request to get information from an API. It doesn't matter what we do. But the point here is that we can do it. We can run code when an event happens or when it occurs based off of a particular element, in this case, that button. So we will get to events in due time. First, we've got to start with the basics of the DOM. And in the next video, I'm actually going to do one more kind of fun demo where we're really going to just wreck this homepage for Google. We're going to animate everything so that it just randomly bounces around and rotates. It's going to be kind of fun, maybe, but if you don't feel like watching that, you just want to get to code and you want to start from the beginning, that will be 2 videos from now. The next video is just another taste of the DOM, part 2. All right, so to summarize everything we saw here, the DOM, document object model, is just a bunch of objects, plain old JavaScript objects. We've worked with them before, but not ones this large, not ones that have so many methods and properties. These are made by the browser based off of the incoming content, the HTML and CSS, other information about a web page. It's all turned into a JavaScript representation of objects that we can use, we can interact with, and we can change. All right, welcome back. This is part 2 of our Taste of the DOM little demonstration. So I'm going to go ahead and play around with Google, the homepage of Google again, but I'm going to do something a little bit more visual, more intense. I'm going to take every element that you see on the screen and animate it around randomly. So it will just end up being a huge mess to try and use. And yeah, just to show you that we can do things like change styles and move things around and animate them. So I'm going to open up my console. Oh, almost there. Command Option J. There we go. And the way I'm going to write my code, instead of just typing it in the console, because I'm going to have probably 10 or 20 lines, I'm going to make a snippet. And in Chrome, to make a snippet, we go to Sources, and then there's a tab called Snippets. If it doesn't show up for you, you can click the arrow and go to Snippets. This allows me to write some code, so I'm going to click New Snippet. I can write code and then run it at any point in the browser without having to make a separate file, and it will be evaluated, and I can do things with the current web page. So I'm just going to try something like console.log 2 + 2. I'm going to save it, and then I can run it either by hitting, where's that button? Right here, clicking this, or using the shortcut, which is what I use, Command Enter on a Mac. If you're on a PC, it will tell you what to use right there. So I just ran it, and if I look at my console, you can see 4 was printed out. So we're not going to be using console.logs or anything right now. I'm instead going to interact with the elements over here on the DOM. Get rid of that triangle. Some fun top Google searches. How to make French toast. Jobs, hiring, and funny cat videos. Can't argue with that. All right, so the first thing I'll show you is that we can create new elements. Super easy. Well, it's relatively easy. Don't worry about any of this syntax. We'll go into the details about how all of this works. But I'm going to make a new image. I'm going to give it a name, my image. I'm going to give it a source, myimage.source equals, and I have a URL I've copied from Unsplash, a free image we can use. And then I'm going to add this image to the DOM. I'm going to insert it. So I'll do document.body.append my image. And if I run this code, I'll hit Command Enter. Oh, there's my image. Very large image, but it's showing up. If I want to amend it to be smaller, my image.style.width equals, let's do 200 pixels. Run this code again. I'll have to refresh my page and run it. Now we have this image of a dog wearing goggles. Okay, so that's the first bit. Now, if I want to move it around, there's a lot of different ways of doing this. The best way would be to do it mostly via CSS. But what I'm going to do is in JavaScript, I'm going to generate some random numbers, an X and a Y coordinate or a position, and use that to move the image to that location using a CSS transform. So if you haven't seen transforms in CSS, this is going to be new, but it's really just a demo of like cool stuff we can do. So don't worry about it. What I'll do is get my image.style.transform, and before I animate anything, I'll just assign a transform. Like how about translate, and then I give it a number like 300, 200. Let's see how that looks. If I run it, oh, I think I forgot the pixels that I need to add, 300 and 200 pixels. Let's try that again. Okay, so now I transformed the image. I moved it over here. I translated it. So that's how we can do it just once. Now, if I wanted to do this randomly and I want to repeat it, I could do it using a set interval. So set interval, I pass in my function. I'll use an arrow function just for some diversity here. And we also need the duration, or how long that interval should be. So every 2 seconds, we'll run this code, and we will transform that image, but let's generate 2 random pixel values. And I'm going to use the dimensions of the screen, which I can access using document.body.client width and client height. So that's something we will see and talk about in greater detail. Document.body.clientWidth times math.random. Make sure I add my parens, and then I'll floor that whole thing as we've seen before to get a whole number. So this will give me a random number between 0 and whatever the width of the window is, which changes depending on the actual width. So here we get a different width versus here. We would be getting 400 pixels. All right, so math.floor, I'm going to save that to a variable called x, and then duplicate this and do the same thing for a variable called y. I'm just getting two random numbers. Math.floor, document.body. I'm going to do client height here. And then I'm going to plug those numbers in right here. So this does need to be a template literal, not single quotes. So I'll put that around my string and then interpolate x pixels and then y pixels. And the moment of truth, let's see what happens. Okay, we're getting something. It's not pretty, it's very jerky, but every 2 seconds it is moving around. And if I wanted to make it smoother, in my CSS, I would add in a transition property, although right now I don't have a CSS style sheet. This is Google's website, so I'll just show you that you can do it through JavaScript. myimage.style.transition equals, and then I'll say all 1 second. Let's do 2 seconds. If this interval is 2 seconds, I'll have it take 2 seconds to translate. And does it work? Ooh, look at that. It's moving all over the place. Okay, so kind of fun. We're picking a random X and Y on the screen and moving the image. That image, for the record, was not there when the page loaded. We're adding it in. So we're seeing a whole bunch of different features already. We created a new element. We updated its source attribute. We added it to the page. Then we added some CSS to it. We changed the width to make it smaller. We changed the transition property to make it smoother when it moves. And then in an interval, we're picking random numbers and using that to generate a translation, a transform across the screen every 2 seconds. Now for the extra fun part, let's do it to every single thing on the page. So this same logic, but I want it to happen for every element. And there's a lot of ways of doing this. What I'm going to do is select all the elements using this document.body.children. Again, this is getting to stuff we have not seen. We haven't seen any of this, so please don't worry about it. We will get to every single line of code we're writing here. We'll have at least a video addressing it and how it works. So document.body.children will give me all the elements that we're seeing on the page. I don't want to select every element in the DOM because there are elements like script tags and link tags and the title tag. We don't want those. We want just the stuff showing up. So document.body.children, I'll just call this all else, all elements. And then I'm going to loop over all elements inside of my interval. So for let L of all else, I'm going to pick an X and a Y. I'm going to use that X and a Y to update the the transform of that element. So let me make this easier to see. Instead of my image.style, I'm going to do L. So I select everything on the page, and then for each one, I'm going to give it a new transform with a new random X and Y, and we'll do it every 2,000 seconds, or 2,000 milliseconds. We'd be here quite a long time if I did it to every one. Whoops. All right, let's go back, try it again, run my code. Fingers crossed. All right, so we only have the dog image that is transitioning smoothly. Everything else is just jerking around. Let's also rotate everything. So we could pick a random rotation here. We'll call this rotation, which needs to be a number between 0 and 360. So we'll do math.random times 360. That should give us a random rotation. And then the way that transform works in CSS is that it wants us to pass in a number of degrees. So we'll do it just like this, $rotation. And then afterwards, we need to write DEG for degrees, like we had to do for pixels. And this should be rotate, not rotation. Let's try it out. And there we go. Things are rotating. They're just not animated except for our one image. So the last thing we'll do is apply a style to everything in the body. We'll add a new part to the style sheet. And I'll just paste the code in for that. Here, what I'm saying is make a new CSS style sheet. Basically, that's what I'm saying. And then add in a new selector. Select everything via CSS. Give it transition of 2 seconds. And then I'll add that style sheet in. Again, don't worry about any of this code whatsoever. But let's just see if it works. I'm going to run it. Fingers crossed. Hey, look at that. Everything's all rotating and going crazy. Moving across the page. It is kind of annoying that this whole thing is treated as one element. This, I think it's called viewport, is the element, so we might be able to break that up a bit. But you can see what I'm trying to show you is that we can select things, we can screw with them in maybe not so nice ways like animating them, but these principles apply for everything we would do. We can interact with the form, get the value out, or change an image source to make a slideshow widget. We can add events like we saw in the last video. We can pick random things and mess with them with random numbers and transformations. Maybe not all that often, but you can do that. We can add new styles to a style sheet. We can make things have a transition. We can create an image out of nowhere and add it to the page. Okay, so I tweaked it ever so slightly. Before, what was happening is I was getting every element in the body, which is really just this one div, and it contains everything, and I was animating this one div, so this whole piece of content was animating together. But now what I've done is updated it so that I'm animating these elements inside that div instead, which you can see here. This is what this line does. If I run it, now we end up with some independent rotation and moving around. Anyways, the whole thing is useless and silly, but it illustrates this idea of changing objects and seeing those changes reflected in the actual browser. So everything we've done has been manipulating JavaScript objects, hence the object model part of the DOM. So really, really important idea behind all of this. The page loads and all of that juicy content is run through the DOM machine, the DOM maker 3000. Obviously not what it's called, but it takes that content, it understands it, it digests it, and it spits out a bunch of JavaScript objects, some of which we interacted with in order to make this happen. And some of which we created from scratch and then told the DOM or told JavaScript to insert them with the rest of the content. Okay, so now that we've had a somewhat overwhelming taste of the DOM, now we're going to go into the basics and start from the beginning. How do we do some of the stuff we just did? We'll go into detail around selecting and changing styles and different attributes and events. There's a lot to talk about. All right, so it's time for our first official video in the real learning part of this DOM stuff. We saw some demos, we got a little taste of the DOM, we talked about HTML and CSS and what you need to know. This is really video 1 of learning the DOM. So we're going to start with the most important part of the DOM, the document. Remember, DOM stands for Document Object Model, and the DOM is just a representation of an actual document made with a bunch of objects, and they're assembled into a tree, this shape that we see over here. There's a hierarchy. They're not just sitting out there in some random order. They're not in an array, for example. I mean, they could be, but then how would we know the relationships between parents and children and the structure? So they are put in a tree-like structure here with branches. And in every tree, there is a topmost piece, what we call the root of the tree, which is kind of the opposite of a regular tree, I guess. The root's down at the bottom. But anyway, we've got the root of the tree, which when we work with the DOM, is an object called document. So document is an object you have in every single browser window that you ever open. You can type document. Every web page, here's one of mine, this one, this simple HTML and CSS demo. If I type document right here, I get a annoying printout. This is not what it actually is. This is the DevTools just showing me the HTML in the document, but if I do console.dir document, we can see the actual underlying object. Now this object represents the entire page, this entire document. If I go to the MDN page, this is actually the docs for the document. If I look at document and do the same thing, console.dir instead, we have another object. And they follow the same pattern. They have a URL, right? There's a URL right there. My URL is different over here. I'm on a file protocol. I'm just viewing my HTML file versus here I'm looking at developer.mozilla.org. And the document contains tons of properties, tons of methods. This is really where we start with everything. So all of the other objects, all of the other pieces of the DOM are located within the document somewhere. It's all nested into a kind of large, confusing structure if you were trying to navigate it yourself. And if you recall from the last couple videos, everything that I was doing, I was typing document.something, document.get element by ID, document.body.children, document.get elements by tag name. There's all of these different methods and properties, and they're all contained within the document object. So the document is the entry point that we use to access the DOM, to manipulate things, to just view the content in the DOM, but also to add events and add functionality. It's all located inside of this one object, the document, and everything else stems from there. So it's created for us automatically. Just like we don't create the DOM ourselves, the browser does it when it loads a page. Same idea. The document will be there for you when a page is opened in the browser or when you view a web page. If we take a look at my web page again, here's the document that I printed out as an object. We'll see a couple other things that might make sense right now. How about images? This is a collection of images on the page. There's one image right now. If I go to the MDN version and I look at document.images, we have, 12 images on this page. If we go back to my version and we instead look at something like, how about document.all right here? This is a property that contains every single element on the page, things we see and don't see. So the title, meta tags, the head, script tags, if we have any, they're all included here. Every single one is turned into a JavaScript object, and itself has tons and tons of properties. And as you can see here, if you were trying to navigate this manually and trying to understand it all, this is just completely overwhelming. But fortunately, we really don't need to know most of it. So the main takeaway here is that we get all these objects for free. We load up a web page in the browser, whether it's a file or we're going to some website, and the DOM is created. All of it is stored inside of one object called the document. But the document has references to all those other objects, as you can see here. If I go to document.all, this is just one way of looking at other elements. I've got 21 different elements. If I do it on MDN, that document object, .all, has, holy cow, 18,940 elements. And each one is going to be a big, massive, crazy object that has tons of stuff inside of it. So that's it for now. The document is our entry point, and that's why all of these methods we run, all of these properties we'll look at, or at least the majority of them, start with document.something, document.doSomething. So we'll see our first batch of methods in the very next video. Very exciting, I think, maybe. Okay, bye. All right, so now that we've seen the document and all of its craziness, all the methods and properties that it holds inside, obviously we didn't see them all or talk about them all, but you saw how many there are. We're going to start by taking a look at the first batch of methods that you should know, the most important methods that have to do with selecting. So selecting is a really important part of the DOM manipulation process. Typically, we select an element or multiple elements and then do something with them. So here's a simple example with paint cards or paint chips. We select one and then give it a new color or do something with it. We could animate it, we could move it around, we could delete it, we could select something and then add a new child within it, a new element. We could select a form and add 2 new buttons to it. We can also do things like add events. So we select an element, a button. We did this early on, actually, 3 videos ago. We selected a button on Google, and then when you hover over it, we alerted some text. So when we want to add some events and interactivity, we still start by selecting. And there's a bunch of different ways to select using the document. I'm going to show you a couple. The first one we'll tackle is called getElementById. This is a method on the document. So we call it as document.getElementById. And it does what it sounds like. It takes an ID and it finds the matching element that it contains or that has that ID on it, and it returns that object. So if we go back to this simple example, we could have any markup, but the markup I have to keep it easy is from a couple videos ago. It looks like this. We have an H1, some paragraphs, I've got a UL, a form, and I have an image that has an ID, bear-photo. Let's add one more ID. Let's do this paragraph here. ID equals text. No, how about main? Sure. So I have two IDs on this page now. I can select those elements using document.getElementById. So it's a method that exists on the document, and I pass in an ID as a string. So I have bare photo, that was one. I'll try that. And you can see what I get back. It returns an element to me. What's annoying, I went over this a couple videos ago, it prints it out as HTML, which is not very useful. But if we save it to a variable, just to make it easier, I'll call this image. And then console.dir image, we can see it's true object form, as we talked about earlier. Here are all the properties I have. So this selects based off of an ID, but it's not returning HTML to me, even though it looks like it is. It's returning an object, and this object represents that one image with the ID. And if we scroll down, we will see ID is set to bare photo, matching this ID right there. We also have properties like the type of the element. Tag name is set to image. We could find the image source right here. This is the image URL. So when we call document.getElementById, pass in a string, if there is a match, and only if there is a match for that ID, we get that element back as an object, the DOM representation of that element, this image. Remember, you're only supposed to have one ID on a page, or one of each ID. So there shouldn't be multiple bare photos, and if there were for some reason, we still only get the first one that matches. So we'll only ever get one element back. And if we pass in an invalid ID, or something that's not on the page, let's do document.getElementId of getElementById of bare in all caps, we get nothing. So no error, we just get null because there isn't an element with that ID. And we'll do one more example. We have something else with an ID, this paragraph. The ID is main. If I select that ID using document.getElementById main, I'll save that to a variable called p. We look at p, it looks like it's HTML, but remember, it's actually an object, console.dir p. Here is our object, and it contains a lot of the similar properties, a lot of the same methods as our image, but different values. For example, we scroll down, all the way down here, we don't have a source attribute because it's not an image. We have tag name set to p because it's a paragraph, it's a p tag. We have the text content, lorem ipsum blah blah blah, that's the content of this paragraph, and there's a whole bunch of other things. One other important topic that we'll see a couple times in this section is that this object here is of a particular type. It is something called an HTML paragraph element. If we look at our image, do I still have it here? Let's do a console.dir image, and we look at what type it is. If you scroll down to the bottom, it's called an HTML image element. So they're both HTML elements, but one is an image element, one is a paragraph element. Now in this course, we haven't talked about prototypes, we haven't talked about constructor functions and classes, so we won't go into much detail here, but all you need to know is that there are different categories of elements on the page, and some of them have their own type, like an HTML paragraph element and an HTML image element. Every image element has a source, for example. A paragraph doesn't. These are just different patterns for these objects. So whenever we get an element by ID, or any of the other select methods we'll see in the next couple videos, they return some sort of element to us. It could be an image element, it could be a paragraph element, it could be something else we haven't seen yet. And that's kind of it for document.getElementById. So we call it on the document, we pass in some ID string, and if there's a match, we get that one element represented as an object. If there's not a match, we get null. Next up, we have another method on the document to select elements, but slightly different. It's called getElementsByTagName, and once again, it does what it sounds like. Rather than selecting by an ID, we select by a type of element. I want all the images, or the paragraphs, or the H1s on a page. So to use it, it's exactly the same. We do document, dot, and then the name of the method. So instead of getElementById, we want getElements with an S by tag name. And that S is significant because we will get more than one element, or potentially we could. And that means that the elements returned are going to be stored in a list. We're not going to get a single element back like we got from getElementById. Okay, so let's try it. What do we have on our page? We've got a couple paragraphs. We have a couple of inputs. Why don't we start with that? Let's get all the inputs. So I pass in the name of the element as a string. And there we go. I'm getting 3 inputs returned. It looks like an array. It is not an array, but we'll come back to that. And if I look at each one of these elements, once again, they are DOM objects. We have an HTML input element this time instead of a paragraph element or an image element. If we try the same thing with a different type, like a p tag, we now get the different paragraphs we have on our page. So there we go, we have 2 paragraphs, the first one and the second one. If I try it instead with, what else do we have? A bunch of LIs on the page. I get 3 LIs. Each one is an object. If I try it on an element that is not on the page, like an H3, there are no H3s, we get an empty collection back. And if I instead try it on something where there's only 1 on the page, like H1, we have 1 H1 on the page right here, I still get a collection. It just has 1 element in it. So we don't ever get 1 element back on its own, like we did with getElementById. It returned the actual object, not a collection. But because we're getting multiple potentially, we always get a collection back. Now let's talk about this collection. What is this HTML collection? It is an array-like object that is not an array. So think of the arguments object that we saw a couple sections ago. Inside of a function, every function has this arguments array-like object that is not actually an array. It's a similar idea here. This is a collection of objects. It's called an HTML collection. It is something that it's a type in the DOM. It's a type of collection you get back frequently. It is not an array. But we can do some array-ish things. So let's save one of these to a variable. Let's select the inputs. So I'll just go back to this line, save it to a variable, const inputs, and now I have my inputs variable. Let's clear this, and let's try accessing the first input. That works. We can use array indices and brackets. Same syntax, it looks like an array. I can get the second element, the third element, and there is no element at index of 3. I can do inputs.length, and I do get a length. But if I want to try using array methods like pop, no luck. Same thing with push, with includes, with index of. We really don't have much at our disposal. In fact, if we look at inputs and you just type dot in the DevTools, here's what we've got. We've got length. We've got a couple methods. These actually come from objects and nothing else. So what do we have here? It's just a bare bones collection that allows us to access elements using indices. And fortunately, we can also iterate. And that's it. It's not supposed to be some useful data structure. It's a very lightweight structure that stores elements. So if you wanted to, you could turn it into an array. You could also just iterate over it like this. Let's do for let input of inputs. Why don't we just console.log input for now? There you go. We're printing out each input. Remember, this is not what they look like. They're actual objects. I hate that the browser does this, Chrome DevTools. I don't understand why. It just doesn't seem that useful to me. Most of the time, we want to look at the object. But maybe that's just because I'm a teacher and I need to show the objects. Who knows? All right, so we can iterate over them. And since it's an iterable, that means we can also use our friend spread. So if I wanted to get these 3 inputs, the inputs HTML collection, it's not an array. If I want to turn it into an array, I can spread it into an array. If you skipped the videos on spread, probably go back, check those out. So now I'll just call this array equals inputs. If we look at array, it's an actual array of those inputs. But honestly, at the end of the day, a lot of the time, what we end up doing is just looping over things and doing some sort of, or making some sort of change to each input or each element. That could be adding a style. It could be reading its current value. If this is a form, a user clicks submit, if we were using JavaScript, we could intercept the form and get the values out, what a user had typed in, and then do something with them. So we could select all inputs and then loop over the inputs and look at input.value. We can actually try that right now if you want. We'll just do console.log input.value. And before I do that, why don't I put some values in here? So bear name, we'll go with Maximus. That's a good bear name. I'll put a password in there, just gibberish password, and take a look. We looped over all those inputs, and I console.log input.value. That is a property on each input element. It has a value. And I get Maximus from the first one, from the second one. And the third one is actually a button as well. And that button does not have a value. And if I look at inputs of 2, that last one, it's that button type set to submit. It does not have a value. So that's just is what it is. We don't get a value. Okay, so that's get elements by tag name. Remember, it returns this array-like object. It's not an actual array, but we can iterate over it. Each element in that array-like object is an element. It's an actual object. And it has a bunch of properties. We can do things with it. And when we call document.getElementsByTagName, we pass in a string representing a tag name. You pass in an invalid tag, you won't get anything. No error. It's just not going to find anything with that type of tag name. So we've seen get element by ID. We've seen get elements by tag name. Next, we have another way of selecting. Next up, a third way of selecting, not by ID, not by tag name, but by class name. So we use a lot of classes traditionally in our markup, so we can style them with CSS. And if we want to select based off of those classes, we have a special method to do just that. Document.getElements, it's plural again, not singular like ID, get elements by class name. And that S right there, the pluralized S on elements, tells us that we'll get a collection back. We'll get multiple elements, or we could get one element, but it will be in a collection, just like we had in the last video. So what classes do I have? I've got a class called Special on 2 LIs, so I could use that. And I think that's the only class I have. Maybe I'll add something to my H1 here. Let's go with class equals header. Okay, and I will refresh my page to get that changed. Now, if I run document.getElementsByClassName of header, we get that H1. Notice it's in an HTML collection once again. Another array imposter. It looks like an array, but we don't get any of those array methods. We could also select multiple. So we have this class called Special. If we select using that class name, we get 2 elements. Each one, once again, is an object. Has a bunch of stuff in it. And if I select something that is not found, like the class name of chickens, nothing has that class name. We get an empty collection. If I try and select based off of an ID, we had an ID called, what do we have, main? It's not going to work. There's nothing with the class name of main. There's something with the ID of main. Different methods, different goals. And that's pretty much it. Get elements by class name does what it sounds like. It's very similar to get elements by tag name, except it uses a different criteria, tag name versus class name. We can iterate over it using a for loop. You could use a regular for loop, a for of loop. One last thing I'll show you, it has to do with all of the methods we've seen so far, is that you don't have to call them only on the document. If I had a very complex document, let's say with like thousands and thousands of elements, if I wanted to select one element and then further search within that one element, I could do that. So here's an example. Let's say I have the class of special somewhere else on my page. Let's do it, I don't know, I'll just put it here. I'll make a paragraph with the class of special and just put some stuff in there. Refresh my page. If I want to search for elements with the class of special, if I do document.getElementsByClassName special, I'm getting all 3. If I only want to get the elements with that class inside of this UL, I can first select the UL. So I could do that with get elements by tag name, get elements by tag name, and I want UL. That gives me a list. So I'm going to take the first one from that collection and save it to a variable called ul. So now I have this variable ul, which is an object, and it has its own copy of get elements by class name or tag name. So I could search within this ul and pass in special. And now I only get those two LIs that have the class of special, because I narrowed it down. I narrowed my search first to the ul. I stored it in a variable, and then I searched for special as a class within that ul, versus earlier, I looked for all elements in the document with that class, and I got 3. So I could mix it up and, use tag name again inside of the ul.get elements by tag name, and then pass in li, and I get the same thing. And now I get 3 elements because there are 3 LIs. I'm not using class, I'm looking for any LI in the ul. One very important note here is that get element by ID does not work this way. Because IDs are supposed to be unique across the entire document, there should only be one element with whatever ID, bare photo. There's no functionality to search within another element. You don't need that. You just search based off of the entire document. So we don't have access to ul.getElementById. We only have, well, I mistyped it. If I type getElement, you can see get elements by class name and by tag name. We don't have ID. All right, so you can winnow it down like that. You can find one element, save it to a variable, search within that if you need to. And that's it for these 3 basic ways of selecting. Get element by ID, get elements by class name, get elements by tag name. Next, we're going to see a whole new way of doing it, a little bit of an improvement, a nicer way of selecting where you only need one method. So we just saw 3 different methods that we can use to select elements, but there's actually a 4th method that rules them all. It's called query selector, and I put an image of a Swiss Army knife here because query selector is like the Swiss Army knife of DOM selectors. It can select everything that we used. It can replicate the functionality of all of these selectors here. We can select by an ID or a tag name or a class name or many other criteria. The way it works is that we pass in a CSS style selector. So we can select a ID using CSS where we pass in the hash symbol, or a class, we use a dot. We can select an element just by writing the name of the element, just like we do in CSS. Over here in my style sheet, where are you? Here we are. We're selecting by ID. We're selecting H1, so we're selecting by class. We can select by attribute. We can do the same thing using query selector. So query selector has not been a thing from the get-go. It hasn't been around as long as things like get element by ID, which is why the other ones exist, because this one is so much more versatile. Query selector seems like it's all you would ever need, and you can use it for everything. It just hasn't been around as long, but it is supported in all the modern browsers, including Internet Explorer. It does work there, unlike a lot of other features that we wish would work. And there are 2 versions of query selector. What we're looking at here, query selector, and also query selector all, which does the same thing except it returns a collection. Query selector, this slide, only returns a single element at most. So let's try it out. Over here, if we want to select the H1 on the page, we could do document.querySelector H1, and we pass in the string H1, and we get that H1 right there. If we wanted to select the paragraph, the first paragraph, we could do it this way. But remember, it only gives us the first match, and there are 2 paragraphs on this page. So we only get the first one. I could also select the first input. And this is essentially replicating get elements by tag name, except we're getting the first match. Remember that get elements by tag name gives us a array-like list versus query selector just gives us the first item, the first match. But we can do more complex things. We could select by an ID. We have to use the hash sign in order to select an ID, just like we do when we're writing CSS. So I have bare photo, I think, if I can remember. Yep, that's our ID for the image here. I also had a different ID. What were you? Main. We could select the second paragraph by using hash and then main. So this is just like document.getElementById main. But here we don't say it's an ID. We just pass in a string. It's assumed it's an ID. When we use query selector, we have to be more specific. We pass in the CSS style selector. So I'm getting the same paragraph. Now, what does query selector actually return to us? Why don't we save both of those to a variable? So the first one I'll save to a variable called main1. And then the second one, where we use getElementById, I'll save to main2. I'll clear my screen, and then let's do the annoying console.dir main1. Open it up. It looks like an object. It is an object. It's an HTML paragraph element. Let's do the same thing for main2. It looks like an object. Scroll down. It is an object, and it's also an HTML paragraph element. All right, so they both give us the same thing in this case. It's just two different ways of selecting. We can also select by class. If I wanted to select these elements, I can only pick one, remember, but this class is used in 3 different places. It's called, what is it? Special. So I can do a document.querySelector of the ID special, where I need to use a period to signify it's an ID. So that gives me the first match, this paragraph here. But because I can pass in a CSS selector, I can get more complex. I can say the first li with the class of special. And this is just valid CSS. So this is no new syntax, assuming that you have some experience with CSS. And that's why I did that whole video about making sure you're cool with HTML and CSS. Anyway, let's go ahead and try something a little more complex. I'll add in a second UL with a couple LIs, but instead of doing it just out in the open inside the body, I'll come down to the end and add in another UL, but I'll put it inside of a section tag. And then I'll have my UL and a couple LIs. I'll do vegetables, I guess, carrots, peas, and broccoli. Broccoli, is there 2 C's in that? Yeah, I think so. I don't know. If I'm wrong, I'm really sorry. Okay, so I've got those in there. Let's give peas the class of special as well. So if I want to select this li right here, using query selector, I need to refresh my page, and I want to select that li right there. With query selector, it's not going to work just by selecting the class of special, because we're getting the first special, which is up here. And it's not going to work to say li with the class of special, because we have this first one that has an li, or is an li with the class of special. So how could I get more specific? Well, this one is located inside of a section tag. So I could do this. This is valid CSS section li.special. I could even get more specific. It won't make a difference here, but it's also nested in a UL inside of a section. So this is saying, find me a list item with the class of special that is nested somewhere in a UL that is itself nested somewhere in a section tag. I mean, I could even do this if I really wanted to, body, and get extra specific. So that's another variation of query selector. That's just a valid CSS selector syntax. We can also select based off of attributes. So if I want to get this password input, right now, if I do document.querySelector of input, you know what will happen. We have multiple inputs. We only get the first one, which is right here, type set to text. If I want that second one, I can do input, where type equals, and then password. So this is using the CSS attribute selector syntax, and now I get that input. And we saw this syntax a couple videos ago with CSS. We did the same thing. It's the identical selector. We just moved it into a JavaScript string and passed it into query selector. So we're not styling anything using this. We're purely selecting. All right, so we've seen that query selector is pretty powerful. We can get a lot more specific. We can, even ignoring the fact that we can get more specific and detailed, we can use query selector in place of all those other methods we saw. And then we have query selector all, which uses the exact same syntax, except it returns to us a collection. So not just the first result. So if I do document.querySelector of input, I get the first input. If I do query selector all, I get all inputs that match, and there's 3 of them. If I did document.querySelector all dot, let's do the class of special we have 4 items. The paragraph with special, and then the 3 LIs. If I do LI, we get 6 of them because there's 6 total LIs on this page. If I do something like the ID of, did we have one called main? I think so. This paragraph is the ID of main. We still get a collection just with 1 item in it. Notice something kind of odd. This result that we're getting back is a node list, but when we do document dot, let's do get elements by tag name, elements by tag name of LIs, we get an HTML collection. Here we got something called a node list. So what is a node list? It's another type of a collection. You don't need to worry about it too much here. But if we look at what the node list contains, this paragraph is still an HTML paragraph element. It's just put in a different container from query selector all. That's how it works. A node list is another array-like object. And if we play around with it, we can save it to a variable. So let's get all of the, which one should we do? Let's save all of the special class elements to a variable. We'll call it specials. And I'll clear my console, make some more room. So we have specials. It is an array-like object, so I can do specials of 0. I can do specials dot length. And then if we do specials dot and then look at what else we have, there's really not much else, but we do have 4 each. So this was not available to us with a HTML collection. It is available with a node list. But don't get bogged down. Don't worry about it. Honestly, it's not a big deal at this point. I just wanted to highlight that there is a slight difference. They're not the exact same type. They're not the exact same collection that we get back, or the container is different. Both of them are fake, lightweight versions of arrays. So that is one difference when you use query selector. And also another difference to know about query selector is that it is a little less performant. It's really not a big deal for the stuff we're doing. But as you can imagine, depending on the selector you pass in, it could have to do a lot of work compared to some of these older versions like get element by ID or get elements by tag name. Generally, those are a little bit more optimized or a little faster, but I definitely would recommend you go with query selector, and that it's not a good enough reason. It's not a good enough difference to not use or to avoid query selector. All right, so query selector all, very useful. It's what I'll be using for most of the course here because we can get more specific, but also it's just nice to use one method and not have to worry about those other methods. You pass in a CSS selector as a string, and you get back either the first match if you're using query selector, or you get back a collection of all matches if you use query selector all.